New York on the World Wide Web, No Holds Barred with Eddie Goldman.
Hello, everyone around the world. Welcome back. This is Eddie Goldman, No Holds Barred. Well, there's been a lot of discussion about the 70th birthday of Muhammad Ali. People that remember the career of the greatest in his prime will also remember his dealings back and forth with Howard Cosell. There's a new biography out of Howard Cosell that treats his career in depth to analysis and a tremendous amount of historical information, called Howard Cosell, the Man, the Myth, and the Transformation of American Sport. It was written by Mark Ribowsky. We have Mark on the line with us to talk to us about Howard Cosell and about this book, and welcome to No Holds Barred.
Hey, how are you?
Glad you could be with us. And the first thing is, for older people maybe around my age, and I think you're a couple of years younger than me, but roughly in the same generation, if you're in the United States or even outside the United States, you know who Howard Cosell is, but there are a lot of younger people who are going to be wondering, what is the big deal about this guy who was a TV broadcaster, why there was so much fuss? So maybe just give a little introduction in terms of why was Cosell so important?
Yeah, that's actually one of the reasons I wrote it, because a whole generation has come about since his death in 1995. And even in 1995, he was sort of becoming a forgotten man, which is unbelievable considering that he was probably the most recognizable cultural icon in the 70s and into the 80s. And I'm not talking only sports, I'm talking about everything. I mean, you couldn't miss the man. He turned around, he was on An Odd Couple, and then he was on a Dean Martin roast, and then he was in a Woody Allen movie, and he was on commercials and here and there. He was just he was all over the place. And for that thing to have fallen so fast was just sort of had an element of Shakespearean tragedy to me. Because the last 15 years of his life were lived that way in a pose of almost living death. And I just thought it would have been excusable if someone who had dominated our culture like that had never had a biography written. And especially for younger people. Because the whole media scene and sports media scene is so different now than it was then, when there were only 3 networks and there wasn't a 24-hour news cycle and there weren't endless highlights, an endless tape loop 24 hours a day. The only real sports information you got on a national level was when Howard Cosell did the halftime highlights on Monday Night Football. It was unbelievable. That's why Howard was the one who announced John Lennon's death in 1980, because there just was nobody else around who could do it, because they weren't live on TV when Lennon was shot. And I think it's incredible for people to realize that now. And so if you read this book, and I hope they will read this book, they'll read of an entirely different time. It's almost like Camelot. It's almost like a fable looking back. And the unfortunate upshot of that is that when Howard left the scene, he took that era with him. He took that element of journalism and sport with him. It's still around. You see it once in a while. Bob Costas does a good interview now and then. You see Bob Lee on ESPN do some good stuff. But Howard did that on an almost daily basis. He brought journalism and entertainment into sports on an almost daily basis. He was that dominant a figure. So I just think it's important for people to realize what bred this current generation of sportscasting as entertainment, which is really what it is. It's really entertainment. And Howard was the one who merged entertainment and sports, but he also merged journalism with sports, and I think that's the missing element that people will find reading this book.
I think the element of journalism is so important because the book, and again, I recommend people to get it, whether you remember Howard Cosell and would try to imitate him, as most sports people did at one point or another because of his distinctive voice and delivery, or whether you're really not familiar with him, because of the story of journalism and sports journalism. I think in a way it's a primer of what you can do and what you can't do or what you're not allowed to do in terms of sports journalism, as well as the story of a man who was reviled by so many people, a lot of which was unjustified, people who, had all sorts of prejudices against him or disagreed with his political stance, and people who were just put off by the 1,000,001 incidents that you talk about, where, as you described, when he died, a lot of people, and I know a lot of people who knew him and worked with him, pretty much all said the same thing. He was just an asshole. And that kind of obscured his importance for today, because the fact that he turned so many people off with his unbelievable arrogance and pomposity and nastiness and all of this was obviously, again, you're writing a biography, it happened, you have to include it in there, but it could also obscure what his significance is, because it's easy enough to say you shouldn't be like that, and it should be easy enough for people to correct it, but it's much harder to get excellence in journalism and sports.
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. Howard broke every rule there was. I mean, he had to, because when he came up in the business in the mid-50s, as you suggest, it was basically, it was a form for Ken dolls to parrot the company line or the sponsor's line or a league's line. Even the sports writers of that day, people like Dick Young, with whom Cosell had that famous feud for so many years, he was a guy who would write tough things, but he was thick as thieves with the owners of these teams, and he would basically parrot a company line as well. You don't want to upset the team that you're covering, because in those days the sports writers were like buddy with the athletes. That's the system Cosell came up, to try to shatter, and as a result, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy that he would make enemies all over the place. He had to. He couldn't help it. In order to shatter that wall, he had to make enemies of the people who were defending that wall. And of course, it was the print media, the sports writers, who were the first line of defense. They were the infantry defending that wall. So as soon as Howard comes up, and he's acting all haughty, and he hasn't even done anything yet, but he's got this big tape recorder strapped to his back, 40-pound tape recorder. He's lugging it into locker rooms, stepping all over the reporters, and the players are flocking to him because this is a new medium now. It's radio and in television, and they want to get themselves seen on radio, heard on radio and seen on television. And all of a sudden, the print media guys are parting like the Red Sea, so players could get to talk to Howard Cosell, and it made for an immediate war that never abated. And Howard only made it worse because he took it to a personal level with those reporters. He would call them ink-stained wretches and 100-hour-a-week clerks. And so he was guaranteeing that later on, when he started losing some of his altitude, that there would be nobody there to defend him. And that's exactly what happened. That's why I was talking before about the last 15 years of his life being so tragic. There was virtually no one who would say, well, we disagreed with some of the things Howard did. He was loud and obnoxious and he obscured his message. But we really do thank him for breaking some of these rules that helped all of us. It made all of us better. It expanded all of our horizons. It made us better at what we did, reporters, journalists. Yet nobody was willing to say that. All they did was say, Howard was an asshole and good riddance to him. And that's part of the reason why we don't see the likes of Howard Cosell now. Nobody's willing to overstep those bounds. And those bounds now are basically what they were when Howard first came up. A bunch of Ken dolls and shrieking, braying mules on ESPN, screaming 24 hours a day about Tim Tebow and other completely irrelevant matters like that. So we don't have that anymore, and we should really mourn that. We really need, I said in the book, we need a Howard Cosell now more than ever. I really believe that.
I agree with you, and in terms of boxing, I don't know how many people really understand how courageous and radical a position he took in the 60s when Muhammad Ali decided that he was not going to be drafted and said he was a conscientious objector, and all the powers that be in boxing stripped him of his title. He hadn't lost in the ring. He was undefeated at the time. And Howard defended him. And when you look back at it today, you may not understand the significance of that, but that was a very courageous and dangerous position for him to take, and almost no other mainstream media person took that position, even though in the end, no less than the U.S. Supreme Court affirmed that position and said, yes, that was a correct legal position. And he burned a lot of bridges. And the major sports writers, the guys who were put as the big, the models, Red Smith, Jim Murray, all the people at that time were all against Muhammad Ali, and most of them wouldn't even call him by Muhammad Ali after he changed his name. And Cosell was very, the Jewish lawyer from Brooklyn was very clear about that you had the right to believe what you want and practice your own faith. And he defended that. And even, I think you mentioned at the end, one of the few people who didn't have complete animosity for Cosell in his later years and when he died was Muhammad Ali, and that Cosell, because of the positions he took on that, and Tommy Smith and John Carlos at the 68 Olympics and supporting Kurt Flood and a number of other issues, remained most popular in the black community, which I found a very interesting analysis.
Yeah, which made that thing, that brouhaha about the little monkey remark later on so ironic and so ironically stupid. People who were piling on Howard, calling him a racist because he made that remark. It wasn't the brightest remark in the world, call a black wide receiver a little monkey. But That was Howard. He called everybody a little monkey, basically, but you just don't say it about a black man. But this is what I was saying before. People were waiting for Howard to make a misstep like that so they could start piling on. You know, they were waiting for years to do something. You know, Dick Young would pick on every little thing as if Howard was committing a heinous crime. But I agree with you about Ali. I mean, that was Howard's shining moment. That was what made Howard Cosell. That's how he made his bona fides by defending Ali. And he did it in a very, very skillful way, in a very smart way. You're right. It was a risky thing to do. It was totally, against the grain of what was going on. You're talking about a time when 90% or more of the American public, and maybe 99% of the American sports media, you know, we're saying this guy should go to jail being draft knives. He should never be seen again in the boxing ring. And Howard, with his law background, having been a lawyer before he became a sportscaster, knew that turf like nobody else. And that's why nobody else, I agree with you, could have done what he did in either the sports, certainly, but even the news divisions of the other networks. They wouldn't have known what to say about due process and the constitutional rights of fair trial and this and that. They wouldn't even know what to say. This was Howard's turf. And it was risky, but it was also something he knew he had to do. He's a man of great principle. And listen, a little cynical also, right? Because if he was proven right, he would be the only guy who was proven right, as he was. And he could play that card the rest of his life. You know, it was always Howard's defense of Muhammad Ali that was mentioned first in all of his obituaries, you know, because it was that important. That was the birth of the American sports journalism industry, such as it is. I mean, it was a one-man industry, basically, with Howard. But that was the birth of it. It was the first time anybody had ever done that. It brought the outside world into the cloistered world of sports. And I think it was the most courageous thing I've ever seen or heard in sports journalism. I don't think there's anything that's even close to that. And you're right, he was proven absolutely 100% correct. That was what the Supreme Court deliberated on. It had nothing to do with Ali's religion. It had nothing to do with the war. It was confined to the Constitution and the Due Process Clause. That was what the Supreme Court ruled in favor of in the Ali case. But by that time, you know, Ali would have been forgotten had Cosell not taken a stand for him. I really believe that. You have to understand, Ali couldn't get a fight in America when he refused to take the step forward. And before they stripped him of the title, he could only fight overseas. These horrible fights. Carl Mildenberger and Henry Cooper and Brian London. Yet ABC, with Cosell at the mic, you know, was there to broadcast these fights, keeping Ali's name before the public. And that was very, very critical. Not only in allowing Ali to have some money to live on those 3.5 years when he was in exile, but it gave him sympathy for the first time. People were, you know, they realized what a great champion he was. Because, you know, they were able to watch his fights at his peak. So this was very, very important to sports history, to legal history, you know, to the history of race relations in America. And Cosell was right there in the forefront. I mean, that was him at his peak. After that came Monday Night Football, which was more like a shtick thing, you know. That was really what made him a super mega star, super mega celebrity, but it also marked the end of the Howard Cosell era as a sports journalist, because he started becoming too much of a caricature of Howard, although there was still times when he could still be the great journalist. But it was really the Ali thing. It cannot be stated loudly enough how important that was to American history.
And my view on Cosell is this, and since I didn't work with him, I didn't personally know him, but like I said, I've worked with a ton of people in boxing and other sports who did work with him very closely, is that I can look beyond all the pomposity and all the personal problems and insecurities that he had from from the standpoint of understanding his historical significance. His critique of boxing in the 1980s still stands today even more, and a lot of people that work with him use the fact that he burned so many bridges personally to try to discredit, saying, oh, it was just the bitterness, what he said. What he wrote about in those last books, I Never Played the Game, and those other books that came out at that point, really is important. He called for a federal boxing commission. He called for much stricter regulation. He railed against the mismatches, such as the Larry Holmes Tex Cobb one, which is the one after which he walked away from boxing. And that also happened within 2 weeks of CBS showing the Ray Mancini-Duk Koo Kim fight, where after Duk Koo Kim died. And you don't see much concern at all today for health and safety from the few remaining boxing media people that are out there. And so while that's why I said it's so important to understand that, yeah, he was such a jerk to so many people, but separate that out from what his message was and evaluate that. And that to me is the significance. And I think for younger people that are getting into the media, you really have to understand historically what Cosell did and separate those things out if you can. Because I think that had he not been so insecure as you laid out in the book, which led to all the arrogance and all the nonsense that went on, he still would have had that message. In fact, if anything, his message would have been stronger than it even was.
Yeah, today you could see really, I mean, like the Penn State thing, because he always hated the NCAA, he thought it was a morass of corruption. And he's right, he was right. And he was crusading about steroids in the early 80s. I mean, think about that. This was before McGuire and Canseco, and, I mean, when nobody even knew what a steroid was, Howard was there. He did some great stuff on his last show for ABC. It was called Sports Beat. It was a magazine show. 60 minutes kind of thing with a sports theme, but they couldn't find an audience for it. They put it on all hours and they couldn't find an audience for it, which is unfortunate, and it helped drive Howard away. Because by then, Howard, as I said before, because of Monday Night Football and all the movies and all the Hollywood garbage that he did, they even tried to turn him into Ed Sullivan for a while, you know. He gave him a show, which was a mega bomb. He was so close to Hollywood people, Sinatra and people like that. You know, he was a sniffer of Hollywood celebrity. So he lost that edge, you know, as Howard, the crusading journalist. But he always had something to say. He always had something important to say. He was amazing that way. If he thought something was a great overriding principle at stake, he would crusade for it. I mean, he wasn't always right. I mean, he took up the cudgels for the USFL when they're challenged against the NFL. And that was a joke. He was involved in the U.S. Boxing Championships, which was that cursed, tainted series that ABC did in conjunction with Don King, where all the fighters, you know, all the ratings were rigged. They had to be associated with King, or they couldn't get rigged. It was a miserable. And when Alex Walu, who was a staffer, just, you know, the future president of the ABC network, was a staffer in the sports department, and he came up with all these rigged ratings and how corrupted that tournament was. Cosell's reaction wasn't to say, "Oh, that's great work, Alex," it was to try to destroy him. He tried to destroy Walu after that because Cosell was the voice of the tournament, and ABC was broadcasting it. And as Dick Young said all the time in his columns, Howard was a shill for ABC. He really was. He never, ever, until the Cobb-Holmes fight came about, which was almost the end of the line for Howard, he never criticized ABC for any of the trash sports that they did. In fact, he was the host of one of the trash sports show, Battle of the Network Stars, you know, because he loved the stars so much. You know, so he corrupted himself in that way. So yeah, you're right. Howard, there's good and there's bad to Howard. I mean, there's very good and very bad. But if you separate out all the nonsense and the clatter and the noise, you have a guy who did basically what no one else could do or would have had the stomach to do. And that's why I give him so much high praise. It's funny because people who've read my book, some of the reviewers, have written that they thought I was ripping him. You know, I hated the guy, detested him. I don't think so. I mean, there's no way that you could come away from the book thinking that I detested Howard. I give him all the credit in the world. But like anybody else like that, driven to great success because of insecurities, there was a lot wrong with the man. There was a lot wrong with the man. And he could have been an even more towering figure had he not been so self-obsessed with the idea of failure and you know, people out to get him. And the book you mentioned before, like I Never Played the Game, that was a horrible, horrible book. It was just Howard venting at anybody who had ever crossed him, which is basically everybody he ever ran across. And what he said about Gifford and Meredith were just you know, it was vicious and brutal, and it was beneath contempt. Because by then he had basically lost it. He had just, the last few years it was like it was like get even time. So I would get even with everybody who in my mind tried to hold me back or tried to do me dirt. And it was beneath the man. It was beneath him that he would read every newspaper in America looking for negative criticism about himself so that he could rip, you know, the sports writer for the Bugle left and right the next day. It was beneath him. He didn't need to do that. But that's what you get with a man like Cosell with all his insecurities. You get greatness and you get the underside of greatness, which is total self-absorption and insecurity. And that's what makes up a genius. You never have a genius with a clean resume. You always have. And I did a book about Al Davis years ago, and it was the same thing with him, driven by these dark, psychotic impulses to succeed in his field. And those two were very much alike, which is why they were very close. Howard stood up for Al when Al left Oakland. You know, Howard for years had crusaded against teams leaving their cities, shipping their fans. You know, musical franchises. All of a sudden, Davis moves to L.A. and Howard's backing him totally. Because to Howard it was totally consistent because as a lawyer, he also found a legal basis for that. And the NFL had dealt with Davis in a select way that they had dealt with no other owner. So, with Howard, it was, you never knew what the impulse would be, how he would come down. I have a feeling if he were around today, he might even say that Joe Paterno was fired illegally the way Ali was stripped of his crown without due process. I believe he would have thrown a curveball like that because that was Howard. He was always looking for that little hidden meaning, that little legal quirk or whatever that would allow him to disagree with the rest of the world. And you have to admire a man like that. You don't have that anymore.
You mentioned, I just got a beef steak for people that aren't familiar about the U.S. Boxing Championships.
Right.
Ring Magazine fabricated fights and included them in their record book at the time, and a number of people that had I think it was a small newsletter that was sort of, even before the internet, they would have been considered bloggers today or something, discovered that, and that brought the whole House of Cards going down, and that Cosell really didn't own up to that as, again, a sign of, the weaknesses. But I remember a couple of years ago going to a media conference in New York, and I asked people that if there were a Howard Cosell today, in today's, again with the internet and everything we have now, where would he be? Would any network put him on? And the general answer people said was no, that if he were around today, he'd have a blog and a podcast.
I don't think Howard would settle for that, I think Howard was not made he wouldn't be made for these times, as in the title of an old Brian Wilson song, He needed to have the entire network at his command. He wanted the world at his fingertips. I don't think a blog would have satisfied him. Because he did write a column for the Daily News, ironically enough, after eviscerating sports writers for so long. The same space held by Dick Young on the back page of the Daily News. But that didn't last for long. I mean, he did some interesting things, but he was pretty much, Howard in print was not the same as Howard, visually or verbally. He didn't have the same impact. And he would write as a lawyer, which, and it would come off very dry and dull. But Howard did try to do that, tried to do the newspaper thing and failed at it. So I would think that if he were around today, the blogs and the internet would not be his cup of tea. He would be looking for, he would be looking for a spot on the evening news, the 5-minute commentary, to do something. He wouldn't get it, but he would swear that he was made for it. Because he always wanted to be the anchor of the nightly news, and Ruin Arledge wouldn't hear of it. Because Arledge by then had become the president of ABC News as well as sports. He never would allow Howard to do that. Howard wanted to be a United States senator. He wanted to be everything. So, I don't think a blog would do it for Howard today. But I tell you, I wish he were around. I'm tired of listening to the same voice and say the same things over and over again. I mean, these panel shows on ESPN, they're all the same. And they talk about the same thing. You can go from the 5 o'clock show to the 5:30 show to the 6 o'clock show and have the same 3 or 4 topics on all of them. And try to do something a little different. Try to dig a little bit. And, then you might be in Howard's, you wouldn't be in Howard's league, but at least, you'd be acting in his footsteps. The only trace we have of Howard now is Chris Berman doing he could go all the way, which was Howard's line on the Monday Night Football highlights. So I wish you were around. I really do, because anyone who comes along and tries to imitate him is just a pale stuff. They say Stephen Smith, that guy on ESPN, is reminiscent of Cosell. He is? Is he really? I mean, really? Do you really want to make that claim? What what walls has he torn down?
Nothing.
I mean, who has he crossed? What commissioner has he made mad? I mean, Howard and Pete Rozelle became lifelong enemies. Do we have a sportscaster or a sports writer who the commissioners of these leagues absolutely detest? No. None
of them in the major media. I mean, there are people like myself and a handful of others who just have kept out of the mainstream media because of that. And that's the point, is that today, even with cable television and the internet and all of that, none of these big media organizations would allow anybody to do anything like that. They're only looking for shows. It's become much more consolidated and much more homogenized. And it was an interesting set of historical circumstances that led for Cosell to exist and be supported at the time. And some of it had to do with ABC being a much smaller and minor TV network at the time, and he helped really build ABC into a major network. That's what Monday Night Football did. You mentioned also Sports Beat. Are those shows available at all for anybody to watch? Because that's often considered his finest work that he did on that show.
Yeah, that's a good question. When doing the research, I was able to get some snippets at the Paley Museum. You know, the William Paley Broadcasting Museum in New York. But I don't even know if ABC has those. You know, they used to tape over those, which is shocking still. They used to tape over like the Olympics and Ali fights, you know, on ABC because they wanted, it was too expensive to buy new tape. This sounds almost like a fairy tale now.
The first Super Bowl was taped over.
It's like a Tonight Show, you know. There's nothing left of Carson's first 5-10 years. I mean, it's unbelievable because I spoke with Dennis Lewin, producer for many years of Monday Night Football and other events on ABC. He had to go into the warehouse. And like he was given a few minutes to salvage a few tapes, only because he did that. Do we have some of those Ali fights now? I don't even think we have the Smith Carlos 68 Mexico City, you know, the Black Power demonstration. I don't even think we have that. I don't think we have any of the NBA from the 60s. You know, it's just shocking to me that they would go in and they would destroy these tapes well, not destroy them, but tape over them just to save a few bucks. A lot of that is Howard. A lot of the stuff Howard did we'll never see. Because Howard did everything, you know. I mean, Howard did everything. He did car racing. he did the Kentucky Derby. I mean, he did everything a man could possibly do, except the Winter Olympics. Because Arledge said, you know, famous line was, "I don't think America's ready to see Howard in a ski vest or a sweater," you know. So yeah, but other than that, Howard. I mean, Howard's boxing at the Olympics. We'll never see that. We'll never see his call of George Foreman. You know, maybe just the last round. You know, we'll never see the entire fight of Foreman or Sugar Ray Leonard. It's just incredible to me. So I don't even know if those sports beats are around. I haven't seen them in their entirety. But I tell you what, if you played them now, you'd learn more about sports than you do from current day journalists. I swear you would, because it would still be very relevant what he talked about.
What would you recommend, particularly to young people who are interested in getting into journalism, but who don't want to be shills for the powers that be that are out there in this circumstances where the sports media, part of it is how it's termed the jockocracy. That's very evident, particularly in NFL football and some other sports. But even the ones that supposedly professionally trained journalists are just regurgitating whatever the owners and the promoters and the commissioners and all these people want. What would you recommend people do in these circumstances who have a conscience and have a point of view and want to go against the tide?
I guess you have to do what Howard did, which is to start at the absolute lowest rung, of the industry, and move your way up from there, but do it in a way where you're not only being a loudmouth, which is a natural instinct today, but saying something of importance. You will get attention for that. You just won't be able to do it on the networks right away. You'd have to do it on a blog or on the internet. So you have to take a fresh angle at something. Some different. Use a legal justification for something, the way Howard did. Although Howard, being a lawyer, he had to jump on everybody. But I just don't know how you could do it nowadays. I really don't. I mean, it's just. I mean, look at the situation we have, like with ESPN, and I hate to keep picking on them, but they are the alleged all sports network, right? They have a system where they're told by their superiors not to report certain negative things about certain athletes. Namely the ones who do those ESPN commercials. This might seem trivial when you're watching those commercials, but they really do have stars come in and do those dumb commercials. And as a result, there are orders, memos passed down from on high, not to rip these guys in any way because they won't come back and do more commercials. I mean, imagine what Howard would have to say about something like that. And he would be, if he was still at ABC, he'd be partners with ESPN. ESPN virtually owns ABC anyway, sports department. So he would be biting the hand that fed him, but he did that regularly anyway. He was given a wide swath. I mean, if he wanted to dump on the NCAA, nobody up at ABC would be allowed to do that, but Howard would be able to because he had earned that. It was like, well, we really can't stop Howard from doing what he was. Howard hosted the first pre-game show for the New York Mets when they first came into being in 1962. He was the pre-game host, and he spent that whole season attacking the Mets. He was doing the pregame show for. Casey Stengel, was an old man who forgot everything he ever knew about baseball. He was sleeping on the bench. He was disgracing New York. He was making losing acceptable. Just imagine that. Just imagine that. I mean, guys who work for baseball teams are shills from the get-go. I don't care how many times Michael Kay says, you can't call me a shill. I'm not a shill. I say what I feel about he's a shill. He's a shill from the get-go. And that's the way it is with everybody else who's ever done a pregame show or an announcing gig. Even some of the greatest announcers, Mel Allen, who was the best I ever heard doing a baseball game, was a total Yankee show. When the Yankees got swept by the Dodgers in '63, he lost his voice on the air. He was so upset. He was so tied into the Yankees. Maybe Vince Scully. No, Vince Scully is he's such a great reporter that I wouldn't even call him a show. But everybody else. So I don't know how you break through that wall anymore. It's worse than when Howard came up. Because when Howard came up, at least you had some great sportscasters. I mean, you had Dowdy and you had Ray Scott and people like that. Even Chris Schenkel was great for a while, before he petered out. You had really great announcers. Now you don't. I mean, and this is my opinion. Maybe you think there are great announcers, but I don't know. There aren't any great announcers. Is Joe Buck a great announcer?
No, I don't think they're great announcers, even by the narrowest standards today, at least in the United States. I've heard some from the UK. I like Ian Darks calling boxing, and they've been using them for soccer as well. But in terms over here, no, even in terms of, you mentioned some of the old-timers like Vince Scully, but no, I don't think, they're just not that interesting, and I've never been that impressed with Bob Costas and Al Michaels and these guys, and even in terms of the simple thing of painting a picture, coming up with memorable phrases on the spot in terms of what's going on in the action. And in boxing, it's absolutely horrid. The announcing on HBO, these guys are doing self-promoting and talking about something 20 or 30 years ago while somebody's knocking somebody out. The famous Cosell call of the first fight with Foreman and Frazier, down goes Frazier, down goes Frazier.
Yeah.
When can you remember a memorable call that the HBO guys have done on any of the boxing fights in the last 20 or 25 years? I've seen almost all of them, and I can't remember any of them or read them. It's gone, and that includes Larry Merchant. I don't think they know boxing, which is one of the criticisms of Cosell, is that he really didn't know.
He didn't at the beginning, but he really did. He made himself into a walking encyclopedia of boxing. Howard. Whatever Howard would do, he would even baseball. He was kind of embarrassing doing baseball toward the end. But Howard was a baseball historian. It's just that the game passed him by. So Merchant was really good for a while. He would really make waves. I mean, you had fighters take punches at Merchant in the ring after a fight. Little Larry Merchant, he's 80 years old now. And I really love Larry. But I think you're right. Now it's sort of they all fade into one another. It's sort of the same athlete. And there's no boxing anyway. I mean, were there like 5 Russian brothers, and that's it? That's boxing? I mean, that's, I don't know. I don't know who the champions are anymore.
Outside the United States, it's bigger. But, yeah, the heavyweight division has basically moved to Europe for a variety of reasons. And, guys like Mayweather and Pacquiao were big, but they're not fighting each other. So
it's not a good, I mean, UFC is much bigger than boxing in America, I mean, that's how bad it's gotten.
And what you mentioned about journalism, one of the last vestiges, as it's being called by the people that put the show together, was ESPN's Outside the Line show on UFC Fighter Pay that they just had this weekend. And we're going to be following up more on that as one of the few examples where, they exposed how the fighters earn a much lower percentage of the gross revenues in UFC than they do in not only the NFL, but in boxing as well, which is being attacked by a lot of the shills in the media of the UFC, even though they provided a lot of evidence for that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, UFC is more pro wrestling to me than boxing, and that's it. What better commentary do you need, right? I mean, boxing is the grand old sport of boxing. Where is it? It's just such a that in itself is, that tells you where the culture is at. And football's gotten like that, and basketball's gotten like that. It's all cheap trash showbiz. Dallas Cowboys or they're in $1 billion, playpen. It's just not. I'm doing a book about Tom Landry now. We're calling it The Last Cowboy, but it could actually be the last American football legend because, it's all. What is it since then? It's all trash and vaudeville since then. So
I'll just give an example about baseball from my own experience. In the 1970s, my father was close friends with somebody who was a small minority owner of the Yankees. And because Steinbrenner was the majority owner, but there were a bunch of these small owners that had like a small piece of the team. And so he would get these season tickets and that they would use, and give them to business people and friends and all that. So a few times a year I would get these great seats that were like at the old stadium in section 13, right behind first base, about 8 to 10 rows back. And as I recall, the face value on those tickets then were $4.
Yeah.
Now, granted, there's been inflation, but I remember at one point I was going to college at 1 year at City College, and on my way, and I was living in the Bronx, and on my way home, I had $4 in my pocket, and I said, you know what, I'm going to stop off and get a bleacher seat at Yankee Stadium to see the game, and I had to spend an extra token. I bought a scorecard, had like a hot dog, bought a $1 bleacher seat, and I still had $1 and a token left over in my pocket. I spent a grand total of $3, and I saw the Yankees beat the Orioles then in the early 1970s. You couldn't, even with inflation, you couldn't even imagine anything like that today. It's no longer become a game of where the average person can go to, except maybe watch it if you pay for cable television, and that has really changed the whole culture of sports. That it's become more of a rich person's plaything rather than something entertainment for the people.
Yeah. Jerry's World in Dallas, that's what they call it, Jerry's World. And listen, I can remember when the bleacher seats at the stadium were 25 cents. I was very young, very very young, but I can remember 25 cents. I had to see Mickey Mantle. It's 50 feet behind Mickey Mantle for a quarter. People don't realize today that sports wasn't always the millionaire, billionaire, province. I mean, they were owned by rich men. I mean, Dan Topping and Del Webb were very rich men, right? But they were not in it just for the return. They really, they stiffed Mickey Mantle. He won the Triple Crown. Next year, he only led the league in home runs and batting average, so he had to take a pay cut. Yeah, I mean, that was the era then, and I'm glad that era is dead and buried. But at least back then you had a sense of, there was a community, a family to these teams. They would stay together for a while. And again, I'm not defending the reserve clause in any way, but I'm just saying, there was more of a, they would be together for years, and it was a lot different than it is now. You just lose your best player now, like a Jose Reyes. It's fact of life. Something wrong with sports, and we probably could use Howard around to write another book, because his last book was called "What's Wrong with Sports," and if that was in the early '90s. How much more is wrong with sports in the 20 years since then?
That's why I like those. See, since I wasn't personally involved with him, that's why I could say yes. All the personal criticisms of him were true because I've heard it from so many different people, and you recount again in the book. But that's why I could say, okay, let's look at what his message was. And there's nobody in the mainstream sports writing that kind of stuff, even closely anymore. And dealing with boxing and mixed martial arts and these other combat sports, there are very, very few people that even want to address these issues. And that's why that to me is the key legacy of Cosell,
right,
of fighting for these changes and fighting to have these sports represent something positive and fighting against all the corruption, which at bottom is driven by money, fighting against all this kind of stuff. And he was far from perfect in doing it, and you talked about, some of the weaknesses and even hypocrisies with, the U.S. Boxing Championships was a real low for him. But he made so many important points that I think that to me is the legacy that stands out more. And even though in the book you say early on he started off as an outlaw and he ended up being the establishment, still I think when you look back on it, if you could pick the good points of what he did and what he said and what he stood for, those are the ones where he stood for some justice and standing for things that are right in sports. And that to me is the real lesson of all this, and of his books as well. I have his books here, and those are some of the few sports books that I look at. Again, and I skip the part where he gets all the personal stuff, but his critique of boxing in those books is spot on, even today.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, people should read those books sort of almost as, scripture, how what used to be and where it went wrong, when it started to go wrong, why it went wrong, and maybe somebody should pick up where Howard left off. But the search made
you're not going to get rich because Cosell apparently was financially well off, and that's not going to happen today. And you got to understand that your choice is going to be, for justice or money, and there's very little in between.
Yeah, that is true. People are they're much wealthier than Howard ever was, although he was never poor. But they're much. It's like sport. It's like it's athletes. they're much, much richer than Mickey Mantle ever was, but they just don't have that soul. You know, they don't have that distinctive core that separates people like that. Everybody's the same, basically, now, you know. Nobody stands above anybody. And that's not how it was. That's not how sports used to be, which is why I did the book, you know, recreate that time that's now gone and forgotten almost.
The book seems to be getting, I read a lot of reviews, it seems to be getting a lot of very good reviews. Is it getting the reaction that you hoped for?
Yeah, it's been very nice. I mean, you know, critics can be. There are always a few clunkers there, here and there, but basically, yeah. And the book's in the 5th printing, and it seems to be going strong, and, you know, it'll be in paperback probably next year. And, you know, yeah, I mean, it turned out well. And even the Cosell family, you know, who refused to cooperate at the beginning, especially his daughter Hillary, who was a very obnoxious person, picked after her old man, clearly. You know, they've come to me and said that they appreciated the work I did because I tried to be very fair. I tried to be even-handed. I mean, Hillary would have, if she ever did a book about her father, would have been, you know, he would have been a king, you know, with no faults. But that wouldn't have been the true picture of Howard. Howard's faults were what drove him to be different. That's the way it is with geniuses like that. And Al Davis, you know, that's why they tear down walls, because they don't listen to the crowd. And, you know, we need people like that. And we don't have them, because people like in sports itself, people have gotten way too soft. And we need somebody with a sharp edge. And unfortunately, the people who pretend to have the sharp edge are just self-promoting loudmouths, you know, who don't really say anything. Howard was a self-promoting loudmouth, but he always said something. And that's a great talent to have had.
I think that sums it up very well. Again, for people like myself who remember all this whole period, it was also a sort of trip down memory lane, but it was very revealing in terms of how different the culture of sports was then, not really that long ago, just a few decades ago. And for people that didn't live through that period, I think it's really instructive as a history. And the book is available, you know, in the usual places. You can get it online, you know, Amazon or wherever they're going to get it. It's Howard Cosell, The Man, the Myth, and the Transformation of American Sports. It's published by W.W. Norton. Mark Ribowsky is the author. And, you know, books, again, in the economic times, I know a lot of people are cutting back on a lot of things. If you're going to get a sports book, get this book because it is so valuable, and particularly for media people that are journalists or aspiring journalists, you have to understand this history in order to be able to do what you're trying to do today in the age of the internet and, you know, mobile communications and all the technology and all the stuff that we have and all the stuff that's coming. So I really recommend the book, and I hope people get the book, even while it's out in hardback. It's not that expensive to get.
No, it's not.
And it'll last better. It'll last a lot better because I have a lot of old hardbacks and paperbacks, and the hardbacks hold up a lot better over the years.
So it's 500 pages, so it's, you know, it's got, in order to deteriorate, it's got to deteriorate page by page, so it's going to take a while.
And it's a really good read, yeah, too. It's a really good read. That's the thing about the book. Really, it's not like reading, you know, a chemistry textbook or something like that. It really reads well because you're also telling a story in it, the story of his life, and that, you know how it's going to end up, but you still want to see the whole story. So there's that aspect of it as well. So I really recommend people to get this book. You know, and I want to thank you for doing it because I think otherwise, I don't know how many other people were planning to write about Cosell, but you say it was just amazing 16 years after his death that there had been no major biography written of somebody who was so important.
Yeah, that was amazing.
There's something about book publishing industry as well.
Oh, yeah. You're right.
All right, Mark, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with us, and we hope to be talking with you soon again. And, you know, good luck with this, and let us know of any further projects.